Have you ever committed to a diet and been so excited when you make it through those first few days or weeks, successfully sticking with your eating plan, diligently watching your calories, but then after eating so well for so long, you find yourself in a moment where you go completely off the rails and start eating so much that it actually hurts. And you think to yourself, well, I haven't been able to eat any of this for the last 30 days, so now's my chance. So you eat and vow to get back to the diet tomorrow. But then the next day, you can't stop gorging on all the stuff that you've been restricting, and you feel like a crazy person, completely out of control and in utter shock that you can't seem to recover that control. Well, if you had known about the study that I'm going to share with you today, then you would not have been in shock. You would have known that this sort of response is exactly what you should expect from any human being who goes through a period of restriction with food. In other words, binging is a predictable human response to semi-starvation, or what most people are doing today as something we collectively call dieting or calorie restriction. So if you have a history of this pattern in your life, today's episode is going to blow your mind and open your eyes to how harmful this behavior is. The study we're going to talk about today is called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. And the stated objective of this study was to describe and analyze changes induced by altered dietary intake, both during starvation and in the process of refeeding. It was conducted in the 1940s with 36 men who were all in their 20s and low 30s. And I love that this study was done with men because women tend to carry more of the stereotype of binging and dieting. But this study shows that this behavior is human. All of the men who participated in the study were rigorously screened and deemed to be mentally and physically healthy before the study. And they had to live at the facility where the study was conducted. The study was 1 year long and was broken out into 3 periods of time. First, there was 3 months of normal eating to create a baseline, which was at around 3,200 calories a day. And then there was a 6-month period of semi-starvation, which was at 1,500 calories a day, which I will note, 1,500 calories a day. This is the same amount of calories that many restrict themselves to today. That was my number for a long time. And I know a lot of people eat even less than that. And finally, there was a 3-month period of rehab, where for the first 3 weeks, the clinicians controlled slowly ramping up the food intake for the safety of the subjects. But then after that, the subjects could eat whatever they wanted and however much they wanted. Okay, so what happened? During the period of semi-starvation, when the subjects ate 1,500 calories a day, the men became completely obsessed with food and developed symptoms similar to binge eating disorder, anorexia, bulimia, and the like. The study authors said, food and all its ramifications became the principal topic of conversation, reading, and daydreams for almost all Minnesota subjects. When they watched a movie, what they would notice most was the frequency with which food and eating were mentioned or displayed on screen. One thing the study authors noted was remarkable was how the men paid attention not to the storyline, not to the love scenes, but to the food. Semi-starvation has been shown in numerous studies to affect libido in both men and women, but this has also been observed historically. The study authors said, preoccupation with thoughts of food is mentioned repeatedly in the field reports from semi-starvation areas. Characteristically, in a hospital for Germans who became Russian prisoners of war, eating and bowel movements, not sex, was the principal topic of conversation, and heated arguments revolved around recipes. Can you imagine a bunch of injured prisoners of war arguing about recipes? They also said, cookbooks, menus, and information bulletins on food production became intensely interesting to many of the men who previously had little or no interest in dietetics or agriculture. And the men devoted much time and energy to collecting recipes, studying cookbooks, contemplating menus, brewing their beverages, fixing their sandwiches. The men in the study also began to hoard food-related items like coffee pots, hot plates, and utensils, and they became obsessed with watching other people eat. When I read about that part, it instantly made me think about those mukbang videos where you watch other people eat food. These videos are so popular. Many of these channels have millions and millions of followers, and I never understood why. But now with the lens of this knowledge, I can't help but wonder if this human response is at play. The men in the study also started licking their plates clean. And keep in mind, this was in the 1940s. There was a different standard of manners during that time and a different cultural understanding of what it means to be polite. What's really interesting is that even after the semi-starvation period was over and the men had unlimited access to food, the study authors noted the licking of plates and neglect of table manners persisted. Attempts to avoid wasting even a particle of food continued in the face of unlimited supplies. An irrational fear that food would not be available or that the opportunity to eat would somehow be taken away from them was present in some of the men. This may have motivated their eating all they could hold at one time. I remember one time my grandma visited me when I was a kid and took me out for ice cream. And she made me stop before I finished it and said, "It's okay. There will always be another chance." And I was like, "No, there won't." And I was so upset at her. This is a classic response to restriction. And in my program, Carnivore Eating Mastery, one of the most common things I would hear my clients say is something like, "This could be my last chance to have this." So even if they didn't want to eat right then, and even if they were full, they'd feel compelled to eat just in case. It's so important to understand this consequence, and it's true even if the food restriction is self-imposed. The subjects in the study also became extremely possessive about their food. The study author said, some hovered low over their trays at the table. They defensively guarded their place in line. Meals became more drawn out, dawdling for 2 hours over a meal and what would previously be eaten in a few minutes. There was also a massive increase in using spices and salt to add flavor, and the men would also dilute and rehydrate their food. With soup, for example, the study authors reported, a man would drink the fluid from his soup, then fill the bowl with hot water, salt it heavily, drink the fluid off again, and repeat this process before eating the solid part of the soup. This is something that has been observed historically in humans, and the study authors note, it is known that under conditions of natural starvation, people fill their stomachs with all kinds of materials, even clay. Many also drastically increased their consumption of coffee, chewing gum, and nicotine. The men were drinking upwards of 15 cups of coffee per day. So the clinicians running the study had to impose a limit of 9 cups of coffee per day, which is still a lot. Same with the gum. The clinicians had to put limits of 2 packs of gum per day because the men would chew 2 to 3 sticks of gum at a time and were consuming up to 40 packs of gum per day, to the point where they were injuring their teeth and jaws. Then with the nicotine, they reported that several men started smoking in order to get relief from the hunger. All of this points to another really common food behavior that I see in my clients, which is compensating for the food restriction by transferring to other consumables like drinks and gum. And that can be coffee, but it can also be diet soda, iced tea, or even electrolyte drinks. I see this so much, and it can be a very big problem for people because it's not addressing the root issue. Now, after the semi-starvation period ended in the study and they moved into the 3-month rehabilitation phase where the subjects could eat however much they wanted, what's disturbing is that even though the restriction was completely over, all the side effects of the restriction persisted. During this rehab phase of completely unrestricted eating, there was rampant binging to the point of illness. Even though the men were warned repeatedly and instructed to not overeat, the subjects binged until the point of vomiting and even hospitalization. The study author said, generally, the men ate more food than they were prepared to cope with. This gluttony resulted in a high incidence of headaches, gastrointestinal distress, and unusual sleepiness. Several men had spells of nausea and vomiting. One man required aspiration and hospitalization for several days. There was also a majorly impaired ability to understand hunger signals across the board for the subjects. For some, this lasted several months, and for some, it took 2 years to return to normal. The subjects reported that even when they were ill from eating so much food, even though they were incapable of ingesting more food, they still felt hungry. The study authors were surprised to see these men struck with hunger pangs immediately after such large meals, and noted that it is certain that they were not caused by the emptiness of the stomach. This is so important to understand because there are many different aspects that contribute to the entire complex of hunger sensation. The study authors also noted that upon refeeding, hunger and appetite were not appeased. As one subject expressed it, "Now I go away from meals hungry 3 times a day instead of 2. Some men reported that their hunger pang seemed more intense than before. This blows my mind. The idea that the hunger was worse in this unrestricted free-for-all eating period than during semi-starvation because of the impact that the restricted eating had on them, that is crazy. The study authors also noted that snacking was constant after the restrictive period ended. Number 122 ate as much as he could hold during the 3 regular meals and ate snacks in the morning, afternoon, and evening. The men frequently found it difficult to stop eating. Number 20 stuffs himself until he is bursting at the seams to the point of being nearly sick, and still he felt hungry. Number 120 reported that he had to discipline himself to keep from eating so much as to become ill. Number 1 ate until he was uncomfortably full, and subject number 30 had so little control over the mechanics of piling it in that he simply had to stay away from food because he could not find a point of satiation even when he was full to the gills. The food restriction that they went through made it so that they had no sense of true hunger signals from their body, just completely deranged eating. The last thing I'll mention is halfway through starvation, 13 out of 34 men mentioned cooking among their plans following completion of the experiment. And indeed, multiple subjects changed their occupations to the food industry after the study was over. Some became chefs, one ran a grocery store, and one went into agriculture. I find this one so interesting because prior to Carnivore, I was a food blogger and recipe developer for 13 years. Despite the fact that I went to school for economics and business, I didn't end up doing any of that because I wanted to work in food so badly. I wanted to make it so that my life was completely about food, searching for recipes, developing recipes, cooking, dining out, sharing it all on YouTube and on my website. And I can't help but wonder if my career was a reflection of being very restricted with my eating since I was a child. Regardless, the behaviors that were demonstrated in this Minnesota Starvation Experiment were very, very familiar to me. And I'm curious if you've ever observed similar behaviors at play in your own life. Now, eventually, the mental and physical symptoms for the men in the study reversed after consistent, adequate nutrition. For some, this took several months, and for some, it took up to 2 or 3 years. They said for one of the subjects that fear that the leftovers might be thrown away was nearly obsessive. In number 102, who felt that he had to consume any uneaten food whether he was hungry or not. I want to remind you that prior to this experiment, these men never struggled with binge eating or any sort of deranged behavior with food. Calorie restriction has disastrous consequences, and I hope that if you have a history of this with your eating, or if it's something that you still do now, that you consider that semi-starvation does far more harm than good. I have seen this in my life, and I have seen this with many of my clients. I've worked with people who had tried to do carnivore while also trying to restrict their calories to levels like 1,500 calories a day, and as you might expect, they could never stick with it for very long. But fortunately, once they started to understand the study, understand where their restrictive behaviors came from and how harmful and ineffective they were able to slowly change their mindset and change their behaviors. If you want to follow the carnivore diet but are battling binge behaviors or completely uncontrolled eating, this is the reason I made my course and program Carnivore Eating Mastery. It is for the people who know carnivore would be so good for them, not just physically, but how it would free them from the burden of constantly fighting food, but need help getting there. If this is you, then go to www.theroadtocarnivore.com to sign up for the waitlist, and I will let you know when I teach the next round. Or you can click the link below.